Hello and welcome to episode 138 of My Circus, My Monkeys. A while ago, I asked folks on our mailing list what topics they'd like me to cover in future episodes. And one person asked, how do I supervise someone who is negative and complains all the time? And this can indeed be a challenging issue. You already face a ton of stressors. So having someone on your team constantly pointing them out and complaining about them just adds to your stress. So today, I'm going to dive into how to more effectively supervise these folks. So keep listening. I think it's safe to say that most of you are not working in a perfect environment. You know, a place where everything just runs smoothly and you and your team love everything about your institution. In fact, I'd wager that you probably have a list of your own of things that you would love to change. And even if you acknowledge that where you work isn't perfect, it can still be frustrating to have team members constantly bring those and other things up all the time. You're already stressed, so this seems like just another thing to be stressed about. But here's the thing, negativity and complaints are often just a symptom of a larger issue. And to figure out how to best approach the complainer, we need to get to the bottom of why it's happening. So before we dive in, let's start by naming our negative employee and call them Celeste, because then we can just talk about Celeste. Okay, so if the title of this episode resonated with you, then you probably have a Celeste of your own. And Celeste may hunt you down to complain. She may be very vocal in individual and group meetings about what's wrong and what will go wrong if whatever happens. And she probably doesn't limit the complaining to just you. There's a 100% chance that she will complain to other team members and even folks across campus. Now, this all sounds like it's a Celeste problem. She's got a bad attitude and it's negatively impacting you and your team, right? Maybe. Let's back up and talk about employee engagement for a minute. And I've gone into depth about employee engagement in other episodes, so feel free to refer back to those to go into more depth. Gallup has found that there are 3 types of employees: engaged, not engaged, and actively disengaged. If you have someone who's negative and complains all the time, they are most likely in this last category, actively and disengaged. Those are the employees who are consistently negative. They monopolize your time with their complaints, and they account for most of the quality problems on your team. Now, we want engaged employees on our team, just like we want our students to be engaged. And at its heart, engagement is about psychological investment in your institution and in the job. And if someone is actively disengaged, knowing why is going to help you decide how to approach that individual. And people's reasons for being actively disengaged is going to vary. So if you legitimately want to address this issue, you're going to have to do a little bit of digging. And I say this not to add more to your plate, but because knowing will allow you to address it more effectively. So if you're not familiar with Gallup's engagement survey, it's called the Q12. And again, I've covered this previously, but in a nutshell, there are things that employees need to have in order to be engaged at work. And these things include having clear expectations about their role, having the materials they need to do their job right, consistent feedback about their performance, opportunities to grow, feeling their opinion counts, etc. And yeah, there are things that they can do to invest in their own engagement, but you and the institution are also responsible for investing in that engagement. And when that doesn't happen, it's not actually surprising that folks stop becoming invested in their job. Now, some folks will just move into that not engaged category, maybe quiet quit or suddenly give their 2 weeks notice, but other people go negative. And honestly, I get it. I was at my last campus job for 12 years, And I'd say the first half of that was amazing. I love the institution, the students, coworkers, my team. Was everything perfect? No, of course not. But overall, it was a great experience and I was an engaged employee. But as a new administration came on board and eventually a new supervisor, those engagement elements that I mentioned earlier started slipping away. And by the end, I was absolutely an actively disengaged employee. Now, I will add that I went through a period of actively expressing my concerns and complaining about things, but eventually I just kind of shut down and planned my escape. So, if you have someone who is negative and complains about things, who suddenly stops that behavior, but you haven't done anything and the environment hasn't changed, it's probably not because they've suddenly found their passion again. They're going to leave. Now, I wanted to talk about engagement because the environment plays a huge factor here. And if you're working at an institution where employees have little autonomy to make decisions, your opinions are ignored if they're even asked for, and you don't even have the resources to do your job well, that's a huge problem. And yes, maybe you're doing the best you can to give your team a good environment to work in. But if the larger culture prevents you from really doing so, that is going to negatively impact your people. The results of such an environment is that folks are going to be less productive and focus on the negative. Okay, so let's go back to my own journey from being an engaged employee to actively disengaged for a minute. Even when I was engaged, it was common for me to identify problem areas and bring them to people's attention. But when that happened, it often led to meaningful change. I felt empowered to be part of the solution and got support from my supervisor to do so. When I noticed, for example, that the RAs who lived in shared rooms just didn't have the privacy they needed to really talk to the residents about their problems and concerns, I drafted a proposal showing exactly why they needed to have singles, and the proposal was approved. In other words, I was engaged and thus invested in making my department better for my team and the students. And I had the power to make changes. After the changes in the administration and with my supervisor, I still noticed things that could be improved and were problematic. And at first, I continued to voice those concerns. But over time, my ability to act on those concerns and make improvements dwindled down to nothing. In fact, the administration and my supervisor kept making decisions without any feedback from me or any expertise even in my area, which just continued to make things worse. So now I had more things to complain about and very little I could do to change them. And I say this because one of the first things you need to ask yourself is, do these complaints have merit? If your Celeste keeps bringing things to your attention that you know are problematic, then they might just be trying to make things better. They might be so frustrated that it feels like complaining, but that's a communication issue, not an actual negativity issue. Now, if that's the case, you need to have an honest look at the overall environment on campus. If all the things Celeste mentions are things you know about, but also feel like you have no power to change them, then the negativity is simply a symptom of a systemic problem. The other thing you need to look at is your own reaction. Hearing valid complaints over and over again when you're already stressed can make you project your own feelings onto Celeste. Now, maybe you're just trying to put your head down and focus on your job because you don't feel empowered to fix things. Maybe Celeste's complaining feels like she's judging you and your abilities, even though you've tried everything you could. Maybe you have positivity as a talent theme, and that's extremely sensitive to any negativity, including legitimate complaints. Maybe you're on the brink of burnout and you just can't. Those are a few examples of how you could be internalizing Celeste's negativity in ways that make you feel like Celeste is the problem. So in your mind, you think, well, if Celeste would just shut the bleep up, you wouldn't have to feel the way that you feel. Now, as with all of my reflection prompts, this is not about judging yourself. It's about being aware of what is really going on. And we've talked about the impact of stress before in many, many episodes. So you know that stress does not bring us out at our best. And it can be difficult to truly assess ourselves or a situation when we're caught in chronic stress, which is why I never shut up about how important stress management and self-care is for you personally and professionally. So you need to know why you're interpreting Celeste's complaints the way that you are. Now, if you've realized that the situation with Celeste is just that she's bringing forth valid complaints that make it difficult for her to do her job, then you have some options. And I will add that those options depend on how empowered you and they are to address the issues that are being complained about. So we're going back to the larger institutional culture / environment here. If the issue is fixable and you can do so, fix it or have Celeste fix it. If possible, have her do it, because then she'll know she can fix other things without it getting to the point where she even feels like she needs to complain. And I will just add that even when we do have some sense of empowerment, there can be limits to that fixing. So perhaps you can't completely resolve the issue or do so in the most ideal way, but that doesn't mean that you can't do something to address the problem and change things for the better. But if you are in a situation where you don't feel empowered, and thus Celeste cannot be, it's time to have an honest conversation about the situation. Now, I often talk about the stories we tell ourselves. And here I'm going to assume that you've already assessed that, and you and Celeste aren't standing in your own way here. If not, you might think about whether or not you have the power to make changes, or if you just believe that you don't. But if you are in a place where you do not have a voice, you do not have the resources you need to do your job effectively, etc. And again, those are all the engagement points I mentioned briefly earlier. You need to decide what you want to do, both of you. Let Celeste know that you hear her concerns, so validate her. But unfortunately, there's nothing you or she can do to change them. And this isn't about bashing your boss or the administration, but rather being honest that, hey, Celeste, I understand your frustration. I feel it too. And I wish we could fix this, but I don't see a way to make that happen given blank, fill in the blank. And when you constantly bring it up, it makes me feel, again, fill in the blank, which really isn't helping the situation. And the point here is to acknowledge Celeste's feelings and concerns, but to be honest about what you can do about them. You can absolutely ask Celeste if there are other things that she or you could do to improve the situation. But beyond that, it is what it is. And if she keeps bringing it up, if she brings it up again, this is where you have to set boundaries and firmly let her know that, hey, nothing's changed. So continuing to focus on this isn't helpful. You don't have to actively suggest she look for another job, but that could honestly be the only option left to both of you to land somewhere where you can feel engaged. Okay, so that was a big picture breakdown. And I started with that because I have seen how much dysfunction is going on these days on campuses everywhere. And there are just so many folks who actually want to make things better, but are frustrated that they have no power to do so. And that is how it ends up as negativity and complaining. But I also want to talk about chronic complainers. And those are the folks who complain about everything, not because they're trying to help or to solve problems, but because they are getting something out of it. And those folks need to be dealt with in a different way. So chronic complainers are the folks who complain about anything, valid or not. And this can seem confusing because if you are great at complaining, you can absolutely hit on some of the things that are legitimate problems. And the difference is that they are more invested in the complaining than the fixing. Now, before we go on, I want to change the name of our chronic complainer to Bill because I've kind of identified with Celeste a little bit. So I don't feel comfortable bringing her into this section. Okay, so why does Bill like to complain about every bleeping thing? For the sake of brevity, doesn't matter. Maybe he learned to do it as a child. Maybe there was a traumatic experience or it is the result of learned helplessness. If so, that is sad. But getting into that is not your job, and nor do you have the expertise to help them unpack that. What is your job is the performance of your team. Now, Celeste was bringing you legitimate issues that need to be addressed, and given the right environment and coaching, she can be part of the solution. Bill, on the other hand, is complaining to perhaps avoid doing the work, but doesn't care to be part of the solution. In fact, even if you do fix whatever the thing he's currently complaining about, he's just going to find something else to complain about after that's done. Now, I don't want to go deep into energy here, but basically Bill is an energy vampire. And he complains to drain you and fuel himself. And so the way you handle Bill is by setting boundaries around the complaining. And I recommend you set up these boundaries with your entire team, because even if folks aren't a Celeste or a Bill, they might still have feedback or thoughts about things that need to change, AKA they have things to complain about, even if it's not all the time. And so you need to coach your team to identify possible solutions along with the problem. If they come to you complaining, make it clear that you want to know how they think this needs to be resolved. No solution? Then you're not listening to their complaint. When you address your team members' complaints by giving them attention and fixing everything, you are encouraging them to continue to complain to you to get attention and get all their problems fixed. I mean, why wouldn't they? If I have a problem and I go to complain to Alicia and she fixes it every time, what I've learned is that Alicia will fix all my problems. And Alicia, if you're listening to this, let's give this a try. That would be great. But if instead Alicia asks me what I think the solution is or what I need from her to address the issue, then the ball is back in my court, other than some pieces that she might have to contribute herself. Now, I might legitimately need Alicia's help or just want her to know about the situation, but now I've been empowered to act, and this sets up a completely different dynamic. Now, Alicia is someone who empowers me to solve the issues that prevent me from doing my job or serving my students. And in this paradigm, I'm going to learn to bring solutions to Alicia because I know she's not going to fix them for me. That's not complaining, that's upgrading systems and resolving problems. And again, Bill doesn't give a bleep about this part. He wants attention, an excuse not to do whatever it is, and or for you to fix it for him. And once you stop entertaining this, he's going to stop coming to you to complain because you're actually expecting him to be part of the solution, which probably means more work. And that's not really why Bill was complaining to begin with. So now you've stopped the cycle. The most important part here is to be consistent, because when Bill shows up to complain, you're going to interrupt him if he seems to be headed into some sort of rant territory. And you're going to ask Bill something like, hey, it seems like you're bringing me an issue that you think we need to resolve. Do you have a potential solution? And if Bill doesn't immediately say, yes, I do, then you need to firmly but politely ask him to leave and come back when he does. And do not let him keep going. Do not let him get out all of his complaints and then ask about, oh, well, what do you think we should do? At this point, you are retraining Bill, and again, perhaps the rest of your team, to come prepared to have a conversation focused on solutions, not problems. If you have folks suffering from not being engaged or even being actively disengaged, empowering them to resolve things could actually boost their engagement level. And if so, great. But even if it doesn't, Bill's going to stop coming by to complain because you've taken all the fun out of it for him. He's no longer getting what he did from that experience. So the last piece of this, if Bill stops going to you because you've cut him off, but is still going around to other team members to complain, then that is another coaching conversation. And I'm going to say there's a 100% chance that that will happen because, again, Bill's doing it because he gets something out of complaining. And all of this goes back to you needing to create a positive environment for your team. And just to be clear, when I say positive environment, I do not mean pretending to be positive to cover up all the not so great stuff. I mean, you want to foster an environment where people can be honest about problems, but by focusing on how to improve the situation. If Bill is only complaining, then he's actively preventing you from creating this environment. And you can't make him be positive, but you can set rules about his behavior at work, including wasting other people's time by complaining. In other words, if Bill needs to talk to Brenda because he's noticed a problem and wants to discuss how they can resolve it together, that's totally fine. But if he just goes to complain to Brenda, then he's going to be written up or whatever consequence you have for that situation. So let's sum this up. If you have an employee who seems overly negative or to complain a lot, the first thing you need to do is assess whether their complaints have merit. If they do, you might need to address your own reaction to their comments. If you're feeling overwhelmed, stressed, or perhaps have positivity as a talent theme, you might be projecting some of your own feelings onto that person. And when that happens, you're suddenly more focused on just making them stop something that you feel uncomfortable instead of addressing the root cause of legitimate concerns, even if they may not be expressing them in the most productive way. So once you've done this, you need to assess your agency in this situation, aka how empowered are you and Celeste to address legitimate concerns? If you're at an institution where you have little or no power to make changes, you need to be realistic with Celeste and yourself and let her know that there's simply nothing that either of you can do. And then it's up to each of you to decide whether that's acceptable for you to work in such an environment. Not ideal, but it is what it is. Then, if Celeste comes back and complains about whatever it is again, politely shut her down and say, unfortunately, things haven't changed, and remind her that complaining actually isn't helping the situation. Now, if you and Celeste can make changes, even if they're not the best, the most ideal ones, then the discussion needs to be focused on what she can do and what she might need from you to improve the situation or the system. And your coaching should be focused around supporting Celeste as she makes the changes necessary to resolve the issue. And of course, if there's something that you need to do to contribute because it's beyond Celeste's scope, you do those things as your schedule permits. That's not to say you drop everything and do it, but within a reasonable amount of time, implement those things. Now, the more this happens, the more empowered she will feel to solve things herself. All right, if you have a bill, make it clear that you're not going to listen to complaining or negativity unless it's coupled with a plan to make the situation better. And again, I'd encourage you to communicate that to everyone on your team, not just chronic complainers. If Bill continues to complain to you, do not hesitate to firmly yet politely cut them off and let them know you're open to discussing this once they've brought you some solutions, but not before then. Be consistent with these parameters, and eventually they'll either start bringing you possible solutions and you can move to the Celeste model, or, and probably more likely, they'll just stop coming to you to complain because it's more work for them and they're not getting anything out of it anymore. Then you just have to make sure they're not diverting their complaining to other staff members. And if that happens, you need to have a conversation with Bill and set clear expectations that unless they're bringing something up with the coworker because they're trying to resolve it, it is getting in the way of people's productivity, and blank is the consequence if they continue. Now, note that none of these strategies are about ignoring legitimate issues. It's about managing them in a way that empowers the team members to fix what they can and keep complaining from negatively impacting your team's well-being and productivity. So 2 things there: fix it if you can. Don't let it impact your team, all the negativity. Now, sometimes these changes are going to take time. So if as you are in the process of making those changes, people are still frustrated, bring things up again, just remind them of the timeline you've set to get where you want to go. Now, unfortunately, if you do not work at an institution that seems to care about you, or that is willing to focus on what employees need to be engaged, then you're going to continue to have legitimate unresolved issues, including team members who stop caring about their job and or perhaps negative. And at a certain point, they're right to be frustrated and disgruntled. And when it gets to that point, the only resolution for them and for your team is for them to leave. In the meantime, you can continue to firmly and politely shut down complaining because it's negatively impacting the team. And if that's where you work, I would just encourage you to think about how that environment is impacting you as well. So hopefully you work somewhere where you and your team members are empowered to make the changes you need for your and your students' success. Then it's just a matter of redirecting the energy folks are using on complaining into solving the problem, or setting clear expectations to chronic complainers that their behavior simply isn't acceptable, and these are the repercussions. All right, hopefully you work somewhere where you and your team members are empowered to make the changes you need for you and your students' success. Then it's just a matter of redirecting the energy those folks are using on complaining into solving the problem, or setting clear expectations to chronic complainers that their behavior simply is no longer acceptable.